Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Kingdom and I'm from Aracy, and welcome to this Aracy webinar, which will feature Julie Sonnemann from the Grattan Institute. Just before we get started, I'll run through some housekeeping so you can get the most out of today's webinar. The first thing is just how to use the GoToWebinar application. Hopefully a slide will appear in front of you in a moment. There we go. Right. So just to let you know, this is being recorded, sadly, for my patchy introduction. On the right of the screen, you should be able to see the GoToWebinar control panel, which looks like the slide in front of you. By clicking the orange arrow, you can open and close your control panel to either see more of the presentation on screen or access webinar features in different panels. The audio panel lets you choose how to listen to the webinar and test your audio settings. If you have any audio issues during the webinar, you can switch, for example, to listen by phone using a dial-in number and PIN. Select Australia as the country to get the right details. Finally, the questions pane. The audience will be muted during the presentation, but you can ask questions at any time by typing them in the panel. We'll be getting to your questions during the Q&A session towards the end. However, if Julie's asked that if you've got any questions that pop up, if you'd like her to clarify anything during her presentation, fire those through and we'll do our best to see them and give those to Julie as she's going. Failing that, we'll try and catch them all at the end. And with the end of housekeeping, I will now hand over to our Chief Executive, Penny Dakin.
Thanks, Paul, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another Aracy webinar. Before we go any further, I do want to acknowledge that we are coming to you today from Ngunnawal land in Canberra, and we want to extend our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the ongoing contributions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, communities and organisations to Australian society. Today's webinar is entitled COVID Catch-Up, Helping Disadvantaged Students Close the Equity Gap. This is also the title of a June 2020 report by the Grattan Institute, a leading non-politically aligned Australian think tank. In that report, Grattan made a number of recommendations, including a national catch-up strategy over 6 months for disadvantaged students hardest hit by the shift to remote schooling during the 2020 COVID-19 crisis. This was based on research showing that the pandemic would likely deepen existing inequities for students, especially those living in greater areas of disadvantage. The Victorian and New South Wales governments have taken this advice on board, announcing more than $500 million in new tutor and learning support to be deployed across schools during this calendar year. Today, we'll hear from co-author Julie Sonnemann, who will discuss the report, how the implementation of recommendations are proceeding in New South Wales and Victoria, and what the data is telling us so far about the effectiveness of the policy and its rollout. Firstly, a little about Julie. Julie is the Fellow for School Education at the Grattan Institute, where she has co-authored several high-profile reports on effective teaching, professional learning, and the report on the COVID catch-up. She has studied high-performing school systems in East Asia and consulted to the OECD Education Directorate. Julie began her career at the Prime Minister's Department and is an economist by training. It's a real pleasure to have Julie along today and to have this partnership with the Grattan Institute and to have it as part of today's webinar as part of our ongoing series of information around the impacts of COVID-19 on children and young people in Australia. So without further ado, I'll pass over to you, Julie, and I'm really looking forward to what you've got to say to us today. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Penny, for that introduction. Just a quick check on whether my slides can be seen. Hopefully that's all going okay.
Hi, Julie. Paul here. We can see you and we can see the slides, so all good, and we can hear you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Great. Thanks so much for the opportunity to present. Aracy is a really respected and long-standing organisation, and at Grattan we certainly draw on a lot of the unique longitudinal data that Aracy collects for our own insights. So really glad to be here today. The topic that I'm speaking to is around COVID and small group tuition. I might just start with, for those who haven't heard too much about Grattan, where, as Penny mentioned, we are an independent think tank in Australia. We're genuinely not politically aligned, which is quite unusual. A lot of our independence comes from the fact that we are We don't do commissioned work, which means that we are able to select and choose the topics that we want to write on, which is partly why we were so fortunate to be able to pivot during COVID to actually look at some of the issues and to recommend what some of the solutions might be. So as mentioned, today will really centre on the report. It was called COVID Catch-Up, Helping Disadvantaged Students Close the Equity Gap. It was written in 6 weeks, which normally our reports take sort of somewhere between 6 to 12 months to write. So it was a really quick turnaround piece. Our main motivation for writing it at the time was because the impact of COVID was clearly going to have a much greater impact on disadvantaged students compared to others with the school lockdowns. And really that just reinforces the role that schools have in terms of being a real equaliser in society. And so given that, we thought it was critical to put our pens down on other priorities to focus on this. And one of the other key motivating reasons for writing this report is also because it's a time when we knew that governments would be looking for solutions, and these windows of opportunity don't come along often in the policy world, and sometimes it's times like this when politicians and governments are really looking to what the evidence base says works, because it is a time of pressure and there is a spotlight on catch up. And so that was one of the other key reasons for working in this space. So today, as Paul introduced, I'll be talking about sort of 3 key areas. One is around the impact of COVID on disadvantage in terms of what the research says, why we recommended small group tuition and the rationale for that, as well as what kind of insights can we gain from the new programs in the next 12 months. Please do ask your questions as we go. There will be time for questions and discussions at the end as well, however. So in terms of just starting with what the data says around remote learning, it's clear that there's really mixed experiences of students of remote schooling during COVID, and a lot of it will depend on what support that students can have in the home. This data from the OECD really shows what I think a lot is generally known, but it's quite stark when you see it presented in this way. And a lot of the time we think some of the things that students are likely to have struggled with during remote learning is a lack of access to books or internet connections and whatnot. And those things definitely are much more of an issue for students who come from low-income households. But actually one of the biggest factors is around the level of parental support for the actual work. And you can see here that just the rates in those areas are a lot higher for students from low socioeconomic families. And the point of looking at this data is really not to name or shame or to come at this issue with a deficit mindset, but really just to point out what is the likely lived experience and therefore what supports need to be in place. The data from Australian teachers at the time of COVID very much pointed to the impacts falling far more heavily on disadvantaged students. So this chart here was taken in around, the data for it was taken in around May in 2020. And you can see that while in most schools, teachers thought that learning at home was not going to be as good as learning in the classroom, teachers in lower CS schools were a lot more pessimistic about those rates. Australian principals, the results coming back at the end of last year were similar in that those who perceived some of the sort of the impacts of COVID on learning generally to be negative were much more likely to be in more less advantaged schools. Our own work really drew on a lot of the rich empirical studies around what happens when students are not in the formal schooling environment. We were fortunate to partner with a UK-based organisation that was also doing similar work at the same time. And I think that was actually one of the benefits of COVID, as other researchers here in the webinar I'm sure will attest to, is that actually you had researchers looking at the same issue all at once. So we were able to partner with them in terms of their sort of deep literature review around what the likely impact would be. And it was a really difficult thing to try to estimate in some ways, because obviously there hasn't been this type of disruption to schooling in the same way. And if you look at sort of other phenomena like, you know, school closures because of snow or adverse weather events or, you know, earthquakes in New Zealand, those weren't often necessarily the best analogies, often because there were other kind of situations, other kind of supports are often put in place in those situations, whereas here what we were really trying to isolate is what is the impact of the home environment on learning, given that students are in the home but still going to school through remotely. So one of the key pieces of research was actually around the summer school learning loss, which is a phenomenon that really is talked about a lot more in the US than it is here, and I think that's partly because they have much more of a culture of summer schools. But if you look at any time over the summer holidays, we know that all students return to school knowing less and forgetting a little bit of what they would have known the year prior. But what's really striking is that students from low socioeconomic family households tend to forget much more. And that really goes to what's happening during that time over the sort of the 6 to 8 weeks when students might be in the family. And, you know, it's just really basic things like less exposure to certain vocabulary that's being discussed in the home, perhaps less engagement, less stimulation in terms of educational activities, less educational outings, things like that. So when you look at the impact of COVID on learning, and we know that what happens in the family home is the biggest impact, we were quite concerned about what this would do to the equity divide. And that it's not just a case of students from less advantaged families falling behind, it's also the case that actually students from some advantaged families will probably get further in front during remote schooling. So, you know, students who may have families who had dedicated parents at home to help them and also to be able to access tutors, and where their school was able to really pivot really quickly and have really high quality online materials, they're actually potentially likely to do quite a bit better, and certainly better than students who don't have those supports. So our work looking at the NAPLAN growth rates over the past number of years estimated what would happen to the gap in Australia. And we could see, what we found was that the gap normally grows each year that students are in school, but that it would grow about 3 times as fast during remote schooling. And to give this some context, so over a period of say 2 months of remote learning, that would roughly translate to an increase in the gap by about 6 weeks between less advantaged students and their more advantaged peers. In terms of who would be most at risk, really, if you look to the NAPLAN data around who is most likely, or sorry, in this case it's the PISA data, but it's very much seen in the NAPLAN data as well, who is most likely to finish school or potentially leave school early or by age 15 and not necessarily have some of those basic skills needed for work and for life more generally. And you can very much see that in terms of the percentage of students failing to meet basic proficiency in the PISA tests. Students who come from a language background other than English, from poorer family households, who live in remote areas or of an Indigenous background are far more likely to fall into these categories. What's also not shown in the data here is obviously, you know, students who might have mental health issues or living out of home care are also far more likely to be at risk as well. So in terms of who we're most concerned about, it's the students who are typically most at risk. What did we actually find in terms of what the impact on learning was around the world? It was very, you know, it's easy for everybody to have these kind of speculative assumptions, but in terms of what the actual data has shown, what's sort of coming to light in the last sort of 3 to 4 months this year from studies undertaken last year is that there was generally learning losses for all students on average, and that the losses fell much more heavily on disadvantaged students. There was one study that was undertaken in the US where it was students from lower socioeconomic households, basically over a 4-month period, returned to school having learnt making virtually no progress, compared to their more advantaged peers who did relatively well. So the impact on the gap was definitely seen. In terms of the Australian data, we're still yet to see a lot of publicly available data. We know in New South Wales there was called a check-in assessment, which is related to the NAPLAN data, and so they were able to calibrate where students were at in 2020 compared to where they would have been at in 2019, and that data was undertaken in about the check-in assessments were undertaken in about 80% of schools in New South Wales, so it's a really high take-up rate. And generally, students in 4 of the 5 tests that were administered, they were all behind on average compared to where they would normally have been in the school year, and somewhere between 2 to 3 months behind and up to 3 to 4 months behind in early reading, which is quite a large finding, really, considering that in New South Wales, the lockdown was only for 7 weeks in terms of remote schooling. So to some degree, we found that quite staggering. Unfortunately, the data wasn't disaggregated to understand what the impact on equity has been. And there hasn't been a lot of public data released in Victoria, but I think if the views of principals and teachers that I mentioned earlier are anything to go by, it's likely to be quite similar. I think what also really is coming to light is just the impacts of COVID on wellbeing. So, and not just for students, but also for teachers. So we know that a lot of teachers are really concerned about drops in student wellbeing, and that has been a big issue. But principals really spoke of the increased pressures that teachers had, no doubt from not only concerns about teaching in an environment where there was low information about the risks to themselves, and some teachers also fall into the demographics where they are at a higher risk of potentially becoming infected, but also just around the stress of having to pivot and teach very quickly to remote schooling. We know that schools did an amazing job, and the department did both departments in New South Wales and Victoria with the lockdown for the longest did an amazing job in putting together resources very quickly. But to some degree, we were caught off guard, and compared to some of the high performing systems, for example, in East Asia, we really were quite underprepared, and obviously not just in the school sector, but in a lot of sectors. You know, even just the switch to wearing masks was so much greater here compared to other countries which were just more familiar. And just as an example, in Singapore, that they have an online curriculum that was just ready to go in terms of switching to remote schooling. So, and students would actually have practice days where they would work from home in preparation for a potential pandemic. So it's unsurprising that, given we were caught off guard, that teachers really bore a lot of the brunt of this in terms of trying to manage online learning, and in some cases face-to-face learning where teachers were still in the school grounds. And this is data that has come back from a survey in Victoria run early this year, which is just looking at the extent to which work-related stress really increased for teachers in the past year, and no doubt is continuing with the catch-up that is now underway. So to touch on how we landed on our recommendations for increased investments in tutoring as a form of catch-up, we took 2 key criteria, and I think this is something that Grattan actually does quite well, in that we seek to make our recommendations practical as well as evidence-based. So our 2 criteria were doing a quick scan of the literature. What are the possible interventions, and what's known about their impact on learning, and how big is that? And then secondly, what can governments pull the trigger on now that can be done across many schools quite quickly, which actually takes a lot of initiatives out of the pool, because as anyone who works in education knows, it can be quite difficult to achieve consistent change at scale across many schools in implementation. So using this, and that second column there, we really looked at what is the evidence in terms of research studies that actually work across a larger population. So it's not just about, has this initiative worked in a small scale controlled trial, but has this initiative also worked when governments actually attempted to support it and back it in many schools? And when you take that lens, the two initiatives that really dropped out at the top were tutoring in small groups, as well as literacy and numeracy programs. And the literacy and numeracy programs there refer a lot to kind of very structured technical approaches around how to best teach reading and math, of which these types of programs can have really large benefits, but obviously they're not necessarily widespread. Often they might be for a particular unit or a particular year level. And so our recommendations actually landed on both of those initiatives, but because literacy and numeracy programs weren't necessarily comprehensive across all year levels or all units of work, it was the tutoring in small groups that really was where we recommended the bigger investments sit behind. I think one of the things to emphasise is that there was a lot of new government money obviously going out at the time of COVID to try and stimulate the economy, and with a particular focus on what will help provide jobs for people. And I think one of the benefits of Grattan is that we do have a whole of government approach. So we do a lot of work on health and housing, but also on budget and central agency priorities. And so with that lens, we could also see that there was a whole tranche of money that was about to be spent. And given schools were likely to be overworked from the lockdowns, this is a real opportunity to actually put your hand up to actually get some of that funding. And so one of the criteria that we also ran over our recommendations was to what extent does this initiative provide opportunities for employment? And I tend to think that that is one of the main reasons why our work was successful in advocating for policy change, why that did occur in this case. And that's partly because we also had a lens to the fact that tutoring would also provide a lot of new jobs in schools and potentially to women, which at the time, the results were coming back to say that women were the hardest hit in the employment sector. So in October last year, James Merlino, the Deputy Premier and Education Minister, announced $250 million to go into tutoring programs for this year. And shortly after, the New South Wales Premier also announced a similar initiative for New South Wales of $337 million for a tutoring support package. South Australia also announced a very small-scale pilot in tutoring not long after. That wasn't necessarily directly in response to the impact of lockdowns, because in South Australia they were actually very small, but it was related to some of the work that was coming through around the time of COVID that was pointing to tutoring as being a promising initiative. So what we now have around Australia this year is a really large experiment, basically, in terms of a whole heap of monies now going into schools for a very specific purpose. And I think for the researchers in the audience, you know, this is a time of real learning and growth where we can actually examine, you know, what is the impact of this initiative in schools in Australia, and what are some of the conditions under which it might work well. So turning to some of, you know, what is known about the success factors of tutoring, from our literature scan at the time and what the state departments have also been promoting since from their own literature scans, is, you know, there's a number of common things that can be pointed to where programs are typically successful. One is obviously getting assessment right up front, and this is not just a case of knowing which students are struggling in class. I think all teachers would know that. It's really getting to the fine-grained detail around why a student's struggling, exactly what concepts are they grasping and grappling with, and that diagnosis isn't always straightforward, and can sometimes take, you know, if you've got years of learning issues that are kind of accumulating over time, it can sometimes take, you know, the opinion of an expert teacher in the school, or a literacy expert, or a numeracy expert, or a specialist in learning needs. You know, a speech pathologist or a lot of allied health staff are really critical here in terms of understanding and analysing why students are struggling. So this is a point in time in which there is now more resources in schools to get this right. and is critical for any tutoring support following that to work well. And just a comment, in terms of that chart, I think this is something that came out of a 2016 Grattan report, which really just shows that there's a spread of up to 8 years in any classroom. You know, this is a big challenge in schools, and I think parents in particular may not realise the extent to which teachers need to be across the learning in many different year levels. And if students are struggling with one concept, it may be because they've missed something 4 years earlier. So a grade 5 teacher not only needs to know the grade 5 curriculum really well, but they need to know all year levels of the curriculum in schools. And this is not an easy task. Other key factors coming out from the research scan is qualified teachers, when used as tutors, have about double the impact. Volunteer tutors sometimes struggle, or particularly where tutors weren't being paid. A lot of the research shows that there haven't been as good of benefits from those programs in terms of the academic learning. Paraprofessionals, though, can get good results when there are really structured supports and programs in place. So even though I think the two major programs in Australia now are using qualified teachers, there is still promising results from paraprofessionals, and given their lower cost, I think those types of alternative program designs, you know, can also deliver results under the right conditions. One of the really key things is around the type of pedagogy used in tutoring. Obviously, it's tutoring in what, like that will obviously have a big impact. And if you look at a lot of the successful tutoring programs, they are quite tight in terms of the specific techniques that are being used to help students improve, the types of materials that are being used to support the tutor. There are some really specific things that can work really well. The smaller the group, the better. So students, generally speaking, more than 5 students, there's declining sort of impact. One-on-one tends to have larger results, although there are some cases where actually groups of 2 or 3 can have more benefits when students can actually see how other students are progressing. So it depends case by case. But generally speaking, very small groups with individual attention matters. Another key success factor is obviously having the right tutor for the right student. So if the student is struggling in maths, ensuring that the tutor has some good grounding in maths, which sounds like common sense, but it is not always easy to find a tutor who will have the necessary skills in the areas that the student might need. And that is no doubt going to be a challenge with the current rollout, because it's being done at such a large scale quite quickly that it will be difficult to find and match students as best as possible. But it's something that does make a difference. And obviously training is something that all tutors, regardless of whether they've already been a teacher before, should access, because obviously being a tutor is slightly different and the skill set is slightly different. You do not need the skills to necessarily be able to control the full classroom, but you need the skills and the understanding of exactly how to bring students who are struggling back up to speed. Really short, regular tutoring sessions are shown to work better, and when they're sustained over a longer period of time. So rather than having one intensive week, for example, of catch-up, it's much better to have staggered kind of learning opportunities over time. And generally, most successful tutoring programs happen over a 10 to 20 week period, with regular kind of interactions between the tutor and the teacher in terms of regular check-ins, so that teachers are aware of what the tutor is doing when they're working with the student, ensuring that they're working on the areas that the teacher thinks is where the student needs the most help. And then also ensuring that if the student is being pulled out of class, if there's any particular concepts or things that they might be missing, that the tutor is then also working with the student on those things to catch up. So that relationship's really important. And lastly, I think one of the key success factors of tutoring, which is not often promoted, is just around that kind of social relationship that tutors can have with students. So it's not just the academics that that tutoring necessarily focuses on. It can impact on student wellbeing and their sense of belonging at school. And I think in this work, we did very much look at, would there be other types of wellbeing interventions that could help students re-engage with school? And obviously there's a lot of broader extracurricular activities that are really important, I think, for students in terms of their confidence. But really, if you want to build their confidence around school, you need to really address the core issue, which is that often students know they're struggling in the classroom. And unless you can make and create a safe space for students to get back on the run there, it's unlikely that their wellbeing in other areas is likely to lift. So how is the tutoring rollout going in New South Wales and Victoria? So so far it sounds as though it is on track. In Victoria, for example, they've recruited more than the 4,000 tutors that they initially intended. I think there's around 5,700 now in schools. In New South Wales, they also had a sort of an equally ambitious target of around 5,000 tutors to recruit and to deliver the program this year. The key features of both programs is that they both use qualified teachers, and they also are open to pre-service teachers as well at universities. Schools very much are in control of the programs, and there is a lot of flexibility and autonomy at the school level around how they can best use the tutors. So that, that includes, which students they're working with, how they're working with them, what types of techniques the tutors will be using. Some of the training has been provided by departments centrally, but a lot of the responsibility is on schools to also make sure that tutors have any sort of top-up training that they might need. I think one of the key things to watch here is that government really needs to step up to play a strong role in how well they monitor what is happening in schools and how the tutoring initiatives are happening in schools, and that they are able to step in when extra support's needed. I think sometimes schools or teachers may not know what they don't know in terms of needing the extra support. So it really comes back to what kind of mechanisms does government have in place to be able to get some insight into how well this initiative is working in schools. And this really throws a light on just some of the existing infrastructure that governments have in normal circumstances to understand what's happening in schools and what extra supports might be needed. But I think in this case, there's much more spotlight because it is a discrete initiative, and so I think the challenge will be for Victorian and New South Wales departments in really watching what's coming back in the evaluations this year around the programs and making any adjustments or tweaks as needed throughout the year. The South Australian tutoring pilot has a much tighter design, so it's a much smaller scale, so it's only $3 million. It will provide a really interesting contrast, I think, to the rollout of the other two tutoring programs, mainly because they've had more time to plan. It's a smaller scale, so they have a lot more going in their favour in terms of getting some of the core elements of implementation right first on a smaller scale before having to roll it out all at once. I think what's really interesting is that there has been tighter selection on tutors to some degree centrally. So there's a little bit more involvement in terms of a central panel sort of handpicking some of the tutors and then matching them to schools. And it also has a tighter design in terms of it being much more focused on one particular subject and for specific students in certain year levels, as opposed to the Victorian and New South Wales schemes where it's a lot broader. So what will we learn from this initiative? I think, there are big evaluations underway in both of the major states, in Victoria and New South Wales, that will be available in 2021. I think evaluating the initiative will be difficult in terms of the amount of variation and flexibility on the ground in schools in how they've executed the tutoring funding. I think to some degree we should be looking at this as this is a good case study of what happens when schools are given the flexibility and the autonomy to use some of the tutoring money how they see fit. Which schools make good use of it, which schools, for whatever reason, weren't able to get many results, and to really understand those conditions. And that learning is key not only for the tutoring initiative, but for how the system is working more generally, because the way that the tutoring initiative is particularly being rolled out in New South Wales and Victoria is very much consistent with the broader ways that most initiatives are rolled out. So I think that is really the key thing to be paying attention to. And I think in terms of what can we learn about the impact of extra resources for tutors, we really need to be looking at the pockets of success. So which schools are getting good results and why are they getting those results? And is there something that they're doing and the way that they're doing it which is necessary for extra resources like this to have an effect in schools? I think the South Australian pilot evaluation will be a great comparison here. And what we're really encouraging at a national scale is that there is a lot of talking and sharing of learnings between Victoria, South Australia and New South Wales about what they've found and about the conditions under which tutoring worked well. So, I mean, as a last comment, I'm very optimistic about the potential impact that we might see from the tutoring program. I think this is a great natural experiment, as some would call it, in that suddenly schools and teachers do have these extra resources at their fingertips. And you know, one thing that we do here is that teachers, you know, they really are stretched in their roles, and I think this will give us a really great insight into what can help students who are struggling to catch up. And if this works under sort of COVID catch-up environment, does this help more broadly and for longer term equity issues in terms of how to close the gap? I've just put a link up there to our report on this issue and also to a link to the Australian Evidence for Learning Toolkit, which is really invaluable in terms of us putting together our report and has a lot of the evidence summaries around tutoring, but also other education initiatives that might be of interest to this audience. So thank you, and I look forward to any questions or discussions that we might now have.
I'll get you on mute. Now you can speak.
Sorry, we've just realised I've been on mute. So basically what I was saying when I was silent, fascinating presentation, Julie. So such interesting data and robust research on which you have grounded the recommendations in your report. Created a lot of interest amongst our audience. We've got a few questions that have come in. I've got a few of my own. We'll just work through them. We've got about 20 minutes. We don't get to everybody's questions that have come in. We'll look to get some answers to those and connect you with Julie. The first question that's come in that I'm particularly interested in is in relation to specific research findings for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, particularly those from remote and very remote communities. Have you seen anything that would be able to sort of relate to that community?
Great question. In terms of Australian studies, there aren't many, but there is actually, and this is profiled in our report, of the studies that do exist around the success of tutoring in Australia, surprisingly, one of the best ones actually comes from an Indigenous population. And that was quite a remote Indigenous population as well. And I can't talk to the specifics of that study, but it's certainly, obviously, there's a number of cultural factors there in terms of how the tutoring is done that would be really important, but certainly very promising results.
Oh, that's fantastic. Another question that's come directly in is, how are schools selected to take advantage of the tutoring? Is it mainly focused on low ICSEA schools or based on assessment results?
Actually, the funding went out to all schools for the tutoring program, with the expectation that students who were struggling the most would receive the attention in schools. That's not necessarily what Grattan Institute recommended. We suggested that there be a really heavy focus on disadvantage in terms of the catch-up funding, but that's the decision that was taken. And I guess with that lens, it does mean that any student, regardless of which school they're in, if they're struggling, they can access the support.
Fantastic. Another particular cohort-specific question. Are there any particular points that have been identified in relation to students with a disability and the impacts this may have for them?
So my understanding from some of the data that students with a disability were some of the worst affected by COVID and remote schooling, and definitely that is a point that I should have mentioned on one of those earlier slides. I think people who rely on care in the classroom obviously struggled a lot at home. I don't have more specific information other than that, but I do know that the money that has been given to schools for tutoring is very flexible. So for students who do have disabilities, who might be mainstream schools in particular, that they would be able to access the support they need through that funding. And that is one of the advantages of the flexibility of the funding that's being given to schools. So I think it's just a case of ensuring that that funding does flow through to the students who need it.
Absolutely, and I guess the only addition that I would make to that is if anyone's looking for more information on those impacts on students with a disability, I would refer them to our really good friends at Children and Young People with a Disability Australia. CIDA produced some amazing work during the whole COVID period, which may sort of go further to that question. This is amazing, Julie. I've got more questions than I can poke a stick at. It's delightful. Are there any early indications regarding the impact of tutoring on school attendance, particularly for kids in the years 5-6 cohort?
Not that I'm aware of. That's a really great question. Unfortunately, there's been limited public data around that. I would not be surprised if there was a positive impact in terms of previous research studies. That's definitely been one of the outcomes. And I think that just speaks to that kind of point of that social connection that students can sometimes have when they feel that there is someone in the classroom that's on their side.
Yeah. One of the, our really strong focuses during 2020 has been on student wellbeing and understanding what that looks like, and particularly the impacts of COVID on student wellbeing. And I know you spoke about it during your presentation. One of the things that we've seen, we during 2020 rolled out a new real-time wellbeing check-in app through a partnership with Educator Impact called Pulse, or EI Pulse. We're just starting to do the data analysis on what that looks like, the sort of findings from the wellbeing check-ins over the 12-month period. I think at some point it's going to be really exciting to sit down with Grattan and actually potentially look at some of these things side by side. Have you got any insights or into research on interventions that support families at home to support students?
I don't have insights into those interventions in any depth. I think it's obviously a really important aspect, given the biggest influence on student learning happens in the home. So much of what we talk about in education is what schools can do and what teachers can do, and that makes a lot of sense because that is the lever for government in education policy. But obviously, the types of family supports that happen in the home, whether it be around the health supports that might be needed, or counselling, financial counselling, for example, for parents who are struggling. I can say that, if you look at the research around recessions, for example, we know that students learn less during those times, and a lot of that is related to the fact that their parents are more often financially stressed. So sometimes, casting a really broad lens on what can be done to help students can sometimes involve, not even some of the social supports in the home, but it can also be the economic supports for parents too. So, but yeah, a really important area, and something that I'd be keen to see what Eracy, develops in that space.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, at Eracy, we've done a lot of work on understanding parent engagement in learning and what that looks like and how to do it, in as best practice way as possible. And we've, for a number of years now, been talking about what we frame as a tripartite relationship between parents, schools, and students themselves, and the best way to maximise both wellbeing and academic outcomes is when those relationships, all three strands of that relationship are strong and are thriving. So yeah, look forward to the work that may come out of that. We've got a lot of questions, Julie, that are coming in that are about the practical side of this program. Where can the students access the tutors? What does it actually look like in its implementation? Have you got, I mean, you've said it's really flexible, but have you got some examples that you could sort of give so people could understand practically what this is looking like on the ground?
Yeah, sure. So for example, in some school, I've heard a story, in Melbourne, like there's a school where there's now 7 tutors that are involved in have been engaged in the secondary school, and they're working with students for sort of 1 hour a week. In other schools, there might only be 2 tutors, for example. So there's the really wide variation in the number of tutors, depending on the school size, school needs, and just the allocation, which is more than likely linked to the levels of disadvantage. So if it's a more disadvantaged school, then it should have more funding to access more tutors. In terms of just some practical examples, there are case studies of a tutor working in the classroom with a small group of students for 50 minutes a week. And then there are some other examples where it might be actually the tutor might be actually a switch. So the tutor might actually be doing some of the more routine kind of work with the whole class, and the teacher then also working with some of the small group struggling students who might need the extra help. So there's some very innovative models. I do know in one school that I visited that they had brought in a really specialist literacy expert to act as the tutor. So there is opportunity to be accessing some of the really specialist types of support that specific students might need in multiple classrooms. So I would be encouraging schools to really think broadly about how to use that tutoring money, given that the government really is giving it to schools in good faith to say, you know what's best in terms of your staff gaps in your school. So, you use it how you see fit.
Yeah, I think that's a fabulous display of faith from governments to be able to put the power into the hands of schools to be able to do that. And at the end of the day, I think those schools know their own communities and know their needs better than anyone. We have another series of questions that particularly relate to students from EAL backgrounds, migrant and refugee families, those type of cohorts who may be operating in or transitioning to English language schools for the first time. Have you seen anything, or are you seeing anything that sort of relates to those cohorts particularly?
I haven't seen anything specific on that, but I think that this is a great opportunity for extra supports, particularly for students in those with those experiences. There is certainly scope to be using the tutoring money to be accessing English as a second language, as an additional language assistance and support for that. So I suspect one of the challenges is going to be finding the right people at the right time, given that every school is sort of looking at this at the moment. So there is the central register that schools can go to try and find the right tutoring support for them. If I think if there are issues there, I would suggest looking broadly. I mean, as I said, the research does say it's not only qualified teachers that can get a positive impact, it can be a paraprofessional as well, or university pre-service teachers are also eligible under this scheme. So it can actually just be about finding the right person with the right skills.
Yeah, indeed. We've talked a lot about the research and a lot about the practicalities of implementation. I work for an organisation has one of our core pillars is around advocacy, and I'm really interested to understand a little bit, what factors do you think helped Grattan be successful in your advocacy strategy in getting these recommendations picked up? I mean, one of the things that we know a lot through the work that we do is that having the answers is not necessarily enough to see them turn into policy. How would you sort of describe the success, I guess, of the report and the translation of the swift translation of those recommendations into policy action?
So I think in this case, I think the timing of the report was so key, and I think it was at a time when governments were wanting the answer. And it was shifting all of our existing work and focusing on that at the time that they wanted it, which wasn't necessarily easy, but we sort of prioritised it. I think the other thing that was really on our side was that the report not only talked about sort of the solutions, but it was quite detailed in terms of here are the next steps. And I think obviously for governments, that's the type of information that can really be make or break in terms of whether they just press the button or not. Because and I think from our own work in this report, we'd really thought about what are the staffing needs for the solution. How would you run it? Therefore, what would the costs be? Just giving some of those ballpark indicators, I think, also can really help. And I think Grattan does put quite a bit of energy there in terms of trying to be extremely practical about what can governments do next. I think the third thing that Grattan does well is around the media engagement and testing the solutions and the ideas with the general public is something that politicians can often put a lot of weight on. And so if you can give some comfort politically that these ideas are resonating with the general public, then that's also something that I think political masters will look to and can be quite important. And I think the last thing is probably, sorry, Penny.
No, I was just going to agree with you.
Yeah. And I think the last thing is around just we've got really good relationships with government, which I'm sure a lot of research organisations do, but just giving them really sharp, targeted briefings. So, PowerPoint slides that really just cut to here's the problem, here's the solution in kind of, in 5 minutes, basically. So making the work extremely accessible quickly.
No, that's such great advice. Thanks, Julia. Really, really interesting. What I do also like about the implementation of this program is the commitment to evaluate what happens. And we've got a question here about when we'll understand more of the impact that this has had, and when are we going to start, I guess you guys and other people are going to write on the impacts. When are we going to start seeing that come out?
So it'll be the end of 2021 is when the large evaluations that governments are running will be completed, because obviously that's when the actual program will be complete. So the funding's only running for 12 months. I think we should get a little bit more understanding sort of halfway through this year around what the impact has been, given that tutoring should only take around 10 to 20 weeks to have an effect. We should start to see some of the early results soon. And from our perspective, we'd really hope that governments are really paying close attention to some of those early results to then understand what type of system supports might need to be in place to get the most out of these programs for the second half of the year.
I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'll be interested to know whether that initial 12 months will be sufficient, and whether we'll be able to capture all of the kids who we might need to capture with 12 months. It's, really hard to say, I think, at this point, but I won't push you on it. Unless you want to.
Well, look, I think it's a great question. I think as with any initiative, and particularly one that's been rushed in this short time frame with COVID, because we've had to, I think there will be a lot of errors and a lot of cases where, for whatever reason, we haven't been able to pick up the students who fell behind. And I think we should be realistic about what are the extra supports that might be required. And I think I think it just goes to the importance of the evaluation, so that we can accurately identify schools and students where teachers feel that there still is a lot of extra support required. It is interesting that if you look at the research, if you get tutoring right, it can have an additional impact of up to 4 to 5 months of learning within a 10 to 20 week period, which is huge. But there's a lot of factors that need to line up in order for tutoring programs to work that well. And so I think we need to be really clear-eyed about the fact that we have had this large period of, to some degree, it will be experimentation, and it is possible that there are students that still have lingering effects that need more help.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it in your presentation, and there's some interest in the questions we're getting in around the quality of tutoring, and the difference between for-profit commercial tutors versus tutoring done in schools themselves, and what are the differences there?
So there isn't a lot of research to say that for-profit tutoring is necessarily lower quality or higher quality than in-school tutoring, and obviously it will just depend on how it works. I think one of the important aspects of tutoring is that the materials that tutors are using, the training that they've received is high quality. Sometimes it can be easier to do those things at scale. It can be easier for tutors to do that when they've got a big pool of resources that they can dip into. So sometimes some for-profit tutoring providers might actually do that really well because they are providing a huge service to a large number of students. Equally, some for-profit providers might do that really poorly if they're just driven by profit, and if for whatever reason they've got really high need students and their costs are not sufficient to cover, their prices are not sufficient to cover their costs. But I think what we do really need to get a grasp on is what is the quality of some of the tutoring providers that schools and rely on, and how does that compare to when a teacher does it within the school gate using their tutors and their own resources. And I think something that is really emphasised here is that we do need to be supporting teachers through this initiative, and that means enabling them to have some control and some say over the funding. In this particular case, teachers haven't been able to use the funding to send students off to a commercial provider, for example, because it is about employing someone in the school. Yep. I think we do need to potentially interrogate that down the track. There might be some cases where actually that could have been a superior service, but I think given the lack of information on quality of for-profit tutoring providers, I can understand why the government has taken that decision in this particular case.
Yeah, I agree. We've got time for one final question, and because it's a race webinar, I'm going to finish with wellbeing because I think it's always, it's the core of what we do. Given the impacts of COVID on student wellbeing, what are your thoughts about whether more money should have been spent on personal supports rather than just the academic tutors? I mean, we know uptake through schools, both public and private, on EI Pulse during 2020 was phenomenal. It was much more than we had anticipated at the time, and we were really lucky with that app. We were able to make it free to all schools very generously through our partnership with Amazon Web Services last year. What are your thoughts on sort of that split of funding between personal support and these academic tutors?
Look, I think the need for mental health supports in schools is a massive issue and something that appears to be under-resourced at present. And I think the Deputy Premier in Victoria in particular spoke about that just last week or the week before, really highlighting that this is on the government radar. In terms of the right split between that and the academic tutors, I can't comment because our work hasn't looked at wellbeing, I think, in the same way that RACI has. But I would certainly expect that there would be increased support on the way, and should be, given the level of need. I mean, our recommendation certainly wasn't fund tutors only. This is just in order to understand and to help students progress in some of their academic learning, and that's really important. But obviously there's a whole area for wellbeing that needs attention too.
No, I couldn't agree with you more, and I certainly wouldn't advocate one over the other. And I think finding the right balance and mix of funding and options is what's centrally, really the most important part of this. So couldn't completely agree with you. Thank you so much, Julie. We've had, I think, one of the best discussions I've had in ages. I'm delighted to be able to talk with you about these really pressing issues and to have you and the Grattan Institute as part of our RACI COVID-19 impact webinars. It's been brilliant. Really appreciate your time and Grattan's time in making you available. So thank you, and thank you to everyone in our audience who's joined us today. If you're wanting to see a recording of this webinar, it'll be available through our e-bulletin either late this week or next week. And yeah, finally, thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much, Penny. It's been a real privilege.